Each year, military installations across North America report thousands of security breaches involving what official reports euphemistically classify as unidentified biological intruders, incidents so disturbing that the Department of Defense maintains a specialized division within NORAD's Cheyenne Mountain Complex, dedicated exclusively to investigating encounters between military personnel and entities that shouldn't exist according to any known branch of zoology or anthropology. It occurs with such alarming frequency that classified budgets exceeding $400 million annually are allocated to what internal documents refer to as the Pale Crawler Protocol, a designation that appears in redacted files dating back to the Korean War era. The remote wilderness regions of the Pacific Northwest have historically housed dozens of classified military facilities sprawling across roughly 42,000 square miles of dense forest, where the Canadian border blurs into terrain so isolated that entire battalions could disappear without civilian populations ever knowing they existed in the first place. For a brief period during the autumn of 1998, a skeletal crew, manning a forgotten listening post deep in the Cascade Mountains, would experience something so visceral and relentlessly terrifying that it would force military psychologists to completely rewrite their protocols for treating combat-related trauma, creating entirely new diagnostic categories for psychological breaks that existing frameworks simply couldn't explain. But what exactly was the pale, emaciated creature that systematically hunted American soldiers through their own fortified compound with an intelligence that suggested terrible purpose rather than animal instinct? And why did satellite imagery from that October show the entire facility being incinerated by airstrike, just 72 hours after the final distress call went silent? The Cascade Range stretches approximately 700 miles through Washington State and British Columbia, a volcanic mountain chain where autumn temperatures plummet to near freezing and fog settles so thick between the two Douglas firs that visibility drops to less than 15 feet on typical October mornings. The region's reputation for unexplained disappearances predates modern record keeping, with indigenous Lummi and Nooksack tribes maintaining oral histories spanning 8 centuries that describe encounters with what their languages variously translate as the crawling starved one, or he who scratches at dawn. Entities allegedly drawn to human settlements during the darkest months when the sun barely crests. The mountain peaks and shadows seem to move independently of any light source. It is perhaps unsurprising then that the Pentagon selected this exact terrain for establishing what they termed minimum footprint monitoring stations. Facilities so classified that they didn't appear on any map, weren't allocated official designation codes, and operated on annual budgets that congressional oversight committees never knew existed perfect locations for the kind of experimental surveillance. Work that required absolute isolation from prying eyes and asking questions that comfortable people preferred not to answer. The earliest documented military encounter with what soldiers would later describe as the Pale Crawler occurred during a 1953 training exercise near Mount Baker, when a 7-man reconnaissance team radioed their base camp describing something that had been following their patrol for 3 consecutive nights. The report, declassified partially in 2004 with massive sections blacked out, contains testimony from Corporal James Whitmore describing a figure approximately 6 feet in length, but appearing somehow compressed, moving on all 4 limbs with joints that bent wrong, skin the color of spoiled milk, stretched over bones that pressed through like tent poles about to tear fabric. The team's radio operator, Specialist Eugene Blackwood, noted in his official statement that the entity's eyes weren't animal eyes. They were voids, spaces where light went in, but nothing came back out. And when it stared at you through the trees, you felt it counting your breaths, timing your heartbeat, learning the rhythm of you so it could match it perfectly when it decided to get close. Of the 7 soldiers in that patrol, only 3 made it back to base camp, and their testimonies were immediately sealed under a classification level that technically didn't exist in public military documentation, suggesting that whatever protocols governed these encounters had been established long before the incident itself occurred. Similar reports surfaced with disturbing regularity throughout the subsequent decades, always following an identical pattern that suggested either coordinated deception on a massive scale or something genuinely predatory, operating throughout the Pacific Northwest with territorial intelligence. A 1967 incident at Fort Lewis involved perimeter guards shooting at something that climbed a 12-foot chain-link fence. Like gravity didn't apply to it, just flowed up the metal like water running uphill. A 1982 report from a classified SIGINT station near the Canadian border described 3 nights of escalating contact culminating in the discovery of Sergeant Michael Torres's body wedged inside a ventilation shaft too narrow for a human to have entered, his face locked in an expression that the investigating officer described as recognition, like he'd seen something he knew but couldn't accept was real. By the late 1990s, internal military documentation had established clear protocols. Facilities in the Cascade region were to maintain reinforced structures, never operate with crews smaller than 8 personnel, and most, tellingly, were authorized to requisition experimental weapon systems that weren't approved for standard deployment, suggesting that conventional firearms had proven insufficient for dealing with whatever these soldiers kept encountering in the endless shadows between ancient trees that had been standing since before America existed as a concept. October 12, 1998, 0300 hours. Staff Sergeant Vincent Reeves of the 204th Military Intelligence Battalion jerked awake in his bunk at Station Coldwater, a signals intelligence outpost so remote that supply helicopters only made the journey once every 3 weeks. With his hand already reaching for the Beretta M9, he kept holstered on his headboard before his conscious mind had fully processed what had pulled him from sleep. The facility consisted of 3 prefabricated structures arranged in a triangle around a central communications tower, housing a skeleton crew of 6 soldiers whose official assignment involved monitoring encrypted transmissions across the Canadian border, though Reeves had long suspected their real purpose involved tracking something far stranger than foreign military communications, given the experimental detection equipment that kept arriving in unmarked crates with installation instructions written in technical language that seemed designed more for hunting than surveillance. His second-in-command, Corporal Amanda Fisher, had been manning the overnight monitor station, a cramped room filled with oscilloscopes and frequency analyzers that bathed everything in sickly green phosphorescent light, and she'd just keyed her radio with a tension in her voice that made Reeves's stomach drop before she'd even finished speaking. "Boss, you need to hear this. Something's moving along the western perimeter fence. And I mean moving wrong, like it's testing the structure inch by inch looking for weak points." The scratching had started 48 hours earlier, so subtle initially that specialist David Park, their communications technician, who everyone called Signal for his uncanny ability to isolate meaningful patterns from radio noise, had dismissed it as branches scraping against the exterior walls during wind gusts that howled down from the mountain, passes strong enough to make the entire compound shudder. But the scratching returned the second night with deliberate rhythm, always at exactly 0300 hours, as if whatever produced the sound possessed an internal clock calibrated to psychological vulnerability. And on this third occurrence, the entire crew had gathered in the main operations room, listening to the methodical scraping that traveled along the corrugated metal walls in a circuit pattern, moving from north to east to south to west before beginning again, always maintaining the exact same cadence, never speeding up or slowing down, suggesting not random animal activity, but calculated reconnaissance performed by something with terrible patience. Sergeant Marcus Webb, their senior analyst who'd served 3 tours in Bosnia and claimed nothing could rattle him anymore, stood with his fingers pressed against the interior wall, tracking the vibration, his face draining of color as he felt the scratches move past his position, and he turned to Reeves with eyes gone wide and whispered hoarsely, "Whatever's making that sound, Vinny, it's not using claws or branches, nose or fingers. I can feel the individual digit impacts, and they're pressing hard enough to leave impressions in steel that's supposed to withstand mortar impacts." The temperature inside the facility had dropped 11 degrees, despite all heating systems functioning normally, and when Corporal Tyrell Washington pressed his hand against one of the small, reinforced windows, condensation from his palm froze instantly into fractal patterns that looked disturbingly organic, like something had breathed against the glass from outside and left its frozen exhalation as a calling card. Reeves had ordered external floodlights activated at 0317 hours, and for exactly 43 seconds, the compound's perimeter blazed with 12,000 lumens of halogen light that should have illuminated every inch of the tree line 100 meters distant. The scratching stopped immediately, but what the crew saw in those 43 seconds before the lights exploded in cascading sequence from some massive electrical surge would haunt their nightmares for whatever time they had remaining. Specialist Jennifer Moss, their youngest crew member fresh from her first deployment, who still carried photos of her high school sweetheart in her vest pocket, had been staring directly at the western fence line when the lights hit, and she described seeing something that had been pressed flat against our wall. I mean, completely flush, like it was part of the metal itself. And when the light touched it, the thing just unfolded. That's the only word. Unfolded like a corpse doing a push-up in reverse. Limbs extending from positions that should have broken bones. The entity was approximately 6 feet long, but only stood perhaps 3.5 feet tall. When standing, represented an inadequate turn for its posture, because it distributed its weight across 4 limbs of nearly equal length that ended in hands, not paws or claws, but unmistakably. Fingers elongated and pale as moonlight on snow, with joints that seemed to contain one too many knuckles. Its head swiveled toward the operations building with mechanical precision, and every soldier present would later independently describe the moment its face aligned with their position, how it possessed eye sockets, but the sockets contained only darkness. Not the reflective tepidum lucidum of animal eyes, but absolute voids that seemed to pull at the edges of vision like optical black holes. And its mouth hung open, revealing teeth that Signal would describe in his debriefing as wrong. All canines, no molars, arranged in 3 rows like a shark, but somehow human-shaped, designed for tearing rather than chewing. The lights failed sequentially from north to south, each explosion producing a shower of sparks and the sharp ozone smell of electrical fire. And in the final half-second before complete darkness reclaimed the compound, the thing moved. Corporal Fisher, who'd competed in track at West Point and could calculate velocity instinctively from years of training, would later testify that the entity covered the distance from fence to building wall, approximately 40 meters in less than 1 second, moving with a fluidity that her brain kept trying to reinterpret as camera trick or editing glitch, because actual flesh and bone couldn't flow across terrain like liquid mercury poured across a tilted surface. The darkness that followed the light's destruction felt thicker than normal absence of illumination, felt almost textured, and the scratching resumed immediately, but now from multiple locations simultaneously. Above them on the roof, below them at the foundation vents, surrounding the entrance on all sides, as if the entity had either multiplied impossibly or moved so rapidly between positions that it created the auditory illusion of plurality. Webb had grabbed his M4 carbine and fired 3 controlled bursts through the exterior wall, where the scratching sounded loudest. And in the muzzle flash, they all saw something that would make him wake up screaming for months afterward. The silhouette of multiple elongated hands pressed against the outside of the building fingers, splayed wide so many hands that they overlapped like scales on a fish, and between 2 of the fingers, a single void socket. I stared through the bullet holes Webb had just created, studying the soldiers inside with what could only be described as curiosity mixed with hunger. The patient assessment of a predator, evaluating whether its prey was worth the effort of breaching their increasingly inadequate shelter. The scratching intensified to a fever, pitched the sound of fingernails on metal, becoming so loud it drowned out radio traffic. And then it simply stopped. The silence that followed somehow worse than the noise, because they all knew with terrible certainty that whatever was outside hadn't left. It had merely finished its reconnaissance and moved to the next phase of whatever nightmare protocol governed its behavior. Reeves made the call to his command structure at 0359 hours, his voice steady despite hands shaking badly enough that Fisher had to hold the radio handset for him, reporting unknown. Hostile entity biological demonstrating signs of intelligence and hostility, requesting immediate extraction for all personnel, compound no longer secure. The response came back after 17 minutes that felt like 17 hours. And the voice on the other end belonged to someone Reeves had never heard before. Someone who spoke with the flat affect of a person reading from a prepared script. Station Coldwater, you are weapons free for any defensive measures necessary. Reinforcements inbound at first light. Do not attempt to evacuate facility under any circumstances. Repeat, remain inside until relief arrives. And Sergeant Reeves, whatever you do, do not acknowledge communication if it attempts to speak. The radio went dead before Reeves could ask what the absolute hell "it attempts to speak" was supposed to mean, and in the suffocating silence that followed from somewhere in the pitch-black forest beyond their walls, they heard a voice thin and reedy, like wind through a damaged pipe, calling out in perfect replication of Corporal Fisher's voice. "Boss, you need to hear this. Something's moving wrong." Reeves had immediately ordered complete radio silence and blackout protocols, sealing every window with emergency shutters while Washington worked frantically to restore backup generator power to at least give them interior lighting and the psychological comfort of being able to see the walls around them rather than existing in darkness that felt increasingly populated by presences they couldn't confirm, but somehow sensed with primal certainty. The facility's emergency procedures, outlined in a 3-inch thick operations manual that Reeves had been required to memorize during his security briefing, contained an entire section highlighted in red ink labeled entity contact protocols that he'd initially dismissed as paranoid Cold War era procedures, left over from when these stations first went operational. But now, as he flipped through pages by flashlight, he realized the protocols were disturbingly specific. Do not respond to voice replication. Do not acknowledge scratching sounds. Do not investigate unusual odors. Maintain interior illumination at all times. Rotate armed personnel at all entrances and shifts no longer than 20 minutes because prolonged observation duty results in compromised judgment and entity susceptibility. Signal had pulled archived incident reports from the station's classified database files that technically shouldn't have existed in an outpost supposedly dedicated to signals intelligence. And what he discovered made the temperature in the operations room feel even colder than the 11-degree drop they'd already experienced. The files detailed 47 separate encounters across 9 different facilities throughout the Cascade region, spanning from 1953 to 1997, each following an identical escalation pattern that their current situation matched with nightmare precision. Night 1 always involved subtle scratching sounds, dismissed as environmental factors. Night 2 featured the scratching in circuit patterns, suggesting reconnaissance. Night 3 brought visual confirmation of the entity, and Night 4, which they were now approaching, historically resulted in what the reports clinically termed barrier breach and personnel casualties averaging 40 to 60%. Moss, whose hands shook so badly she'd spilled coffee across her keyboard twice in the past hour, had discovered a subsection of files marked with a designation code she didn't recognize. Rake Protocol Lethal Force Authorization. The documents described the entity using terminology that blurred the line between zoology and demonology, noting that it demonstrated tool use intelligence, problem-solving capability, apparent comprehension of human psychology, and most disturbingly, evidence of intentional psychological warfare tactics, including voice replication, strategic timing of appearances, and behavioral patterns suggesting it derived stimulation from inducing fear responses prior to physical attack. One report authored by a Dr. Sarah Kellerman, who held credentials from both the CDC and an organization called the Fortean Research Division that didn't appear in any public database, theorized that the entities weren't supernatural, but represented an undiscovered hominid species that had evolved in parallel to human development, developing intelligence specifically, optimized for nocturnal predation, and possessing neurology that made them appear almost supernatural due to reaction speeds and sensory capabilities far exceeding human norms. The second incident struck at 0441 hours when Washington, who'd been maintaining watch at the southern entrance, keyed his radio with barely controlled panic and reported seeing something pressed against the reinforced window of the exterior storage shed, a structure about 30 meters from the main building where they kept fuel drums and emergency supplies. Through night vision goggles, he could see it clearly. A figure crouched on all fours atop the shed's roof, and as he watched it slowly, deliberately dragged one elongated hand across the corrugated metal surface, producing a screech that even through the sealed walls of their building made Moss actually vomit into a wastebasket from pure visceral revulsion. The entity's head swiveled with mechanical precision until its void-socket eyes aligned directly with the operations building, specifically with the exact window where Washington stood watching, and the implications of that targeting accuracy, the fact that it knew precisely where he was positioned despite the darkness and distance made Washington back away from his post, repeating, "It sees me. How does it see me? There's no light. There's no way it can see me, but it's looking right at fucking me." Webb joined Washington at the window, and together they watched as the entity on the shed roof began moving in a circle, around and around on all fours, with its spine arched in a position that would have paralyzed a human being. And as it circled, it started making sounds. Not the screech of nails on metal, but something far worse. A rhythmic clicking that echoed across the compound with acoustic properties that seemed designed to resonate inside human skulls, triggering something deep in the limbic system that predated language, the same instinctive terror that made prey animals freeze when predators approached. The clicking suddenly stopped, and in the half-second of silence before the next nightmare began, they all heard it, a voice coming from outside that perfectly replicated Reeves's own voice, his accent, his speech patterns, even the slight rasp he got when stressed. "Station Coldwater, you are weapons free for any defensive measures necessary. Reinforcements inbound at first light. Do not attempt to evacuate." Fisher grabbed Reeves's arm hard enough to leave bruises, her eyes gone wide, because they both realized the same terrible thing simultaneously. The entity had heard the radio transmission from their command structure and was now playing it back to them, demonstrating not just mimicry, but comprehension, proving it understood that certain phrases held meaning for the humans cowering inside their increasingly inadequate shelter. The voice continued, still using Reeves's stolen vocal patterns. "Do not acknowledge if it attempts to speak. Do not acknowledge if it attempts to speak. Do not acknowledge. Do not, do not, do. The repetition degrading into a stuttering loop like a damaged recording before cutting off abruptly and being replaced by Fisher's voice saying, "Something's moving wrong," over and over again in varying tones that ranged from calm observation to absolute screaming terror. At 0512 hours, the backup generator that Washington had worked so hard to restore suddenly cut out, plunging them into complete darkness for exactly 7 seconds before emergency battery lights kicked in, dim red illumination that turned the operations room into something that resembled the interior of a dying organism. In those 7 seconds of total darkness, Signal reported feeling something brush against the back of his neck, a touch so light it might have been imagined, except his skin where contact occurred had gone numb, completely without sensation. And when Fisher shined her flashlight on the area, they saw 3 parallel scratches, shallow but perfectly straight, as if something with impossible precision had marked him through the walls, through the air itself, a warning or perhaps a preview of what was coming. Moss was openly crying now, clutching her service weapon with both hands while whispering prayers in Korean that her grandmother had taught her. And Webb had started exhibiting signs of psychological breakdown, talking to himself in muttered streams about how it's not real, it's psyops, it's mass hallucination. We're being tested. This is some fucked up McCulture shit. They're testing to see how we handle stress. Reeves knew they wouldn't survive until first light, not if the historical patterns in those archived reports held true. And as he watched the scratches on Signal's neck beginning to seep blood in thin, precise lines, he realized with sick certainty that whatever was outside had already been inside, had already marked them, and was simply waiting for the right moment to finish what it had started. The third wave came at 0547 hours, just 13 minutes before official sunrise, as if the entity possessed perfect temporal awareness and wanted to complete its work before daylight arrived. The scratching that had stopped after the generator failure resumed, but now it came from everywhere simultaneously. Above them on the reinforced roof, below them through the concrete foundation, surrounding every window and door. And the sound had changed from reconnaissance scraping to something far more purposeful. The distinct noise of metal being scored and torn, of barriers being systematically dismantled by something with strength that shouldn't exist in a frame that appeared so skeletal and wasted. Webb had positioned himself at the main entrance, with his M4 trained on the reinforced door, but his hands shook so badly that Fisher had to steady his aim. And when the door began bulging inward, the steel actually deforming like aluminum foil, pressed by invisible thumbs, he opened fire in full automatic, emptying an entire magazine into the barrier while screaming incoherently. The gunfire's concussion in the confined space left them all temporarily deaf ears, ringing with high-pitched whine, but through that auditory damage they could still hear the scratching. Reeves had grabbed their emergency satellite phone, the last line of communication after the radio systems had degraded into static and what sounded disturbingly like recorded laughter, and he punched in the classified emergency code that was supposed to trigger immediate aerial response for situations exceeding conventional threat parameters. The voice that answered wasn't human. He knew that immediately, because it spoke with his own voice, but the words came too fast, syllables compressed and overlapping. Slashen Strentren Trikurpent Minutes before he could respond. It responded. It could respond sexuchiting conventional threat parameters. Before he could scream that they were still alive and needed extraction, not incineration, the line went dead, and he realized with absolute horror that whoever or whatever was on the other end had just pronounced their death sentence. That command had decided losing 6 soldiers was acceptable losses compared to whatever risk letting this thing potentially escape represented. Fisher saw the expression on his face and knew without asking, putting together the pieces. The isolated location, the experimental equipment, the archived incident reports. They'd never been here to monitor communications. They'd been bait, carefully positioned prey, meant to attract and contain something that military intelligence had been tracking for decades, but couldn't capture through conventional means. The roof collapsed inward at 0553 hours, not the entire structure, but a section above the communications equipment and through the jagged hole. They saw it not one entity, but 7 all crouched on the exposed roof beams in a circle, looking down at them with those void socket eyes that seemed to drink in light and hope and sanity with equal hunger. The entities were identical, suggesting either perfect genetic cloning or something far stranger, each possessing that same emaciated frame, covered in skin so pale it appeared luminescent against the pre-dawn darkness, limbs too long and joints too numerous, hands that could grip and manipulate with precision that belied their monstrous appearance. Washington opened fire upward, and Signal joined him, both soldiers emptying their magazines at the circle of watchers. But the entities moved before the bullets arrived, scattering across the roof beams with speed that left after images flowing around the projectiles like water around stones, and the two that had been struck directly. Center mass hits that should have been fatal simply paused, looked down at the wounds that weren't bleeding, and continued moving as if being shot was a minor inconvenience rather than trauma that should have ended their threat. The temperature inside the facility had now dropped to near freezing, and their breath came out in clouds that immediately crystallized and fell like snow, accumulating on surfaces in patterns that resembled scratch marks, as if even the environment was being infected by the entity's presence and transformed into something hostile and alien. Moss had backed herself into a corner, service weapon empty, alternating between laughing and sobbing while Signal tried desperately to reach her, to pull her back to some semblance of psychological stability, but she'd broken completely. Kept saying, "They're not climbing down because they want us to understand. They want us to know we never had a chance. This was always going to end this way. They've been doing this for so long, thousands of years. We're not the first. We're not even close to the first." One of the entities on the roof suddenly dropped through the hole, not climbing or descending, but simply releasing grip and falling, landing on all fours with impossible grace that shouldn't have been survivable from a 12-foot drop. And up close, they could see details that made anatomical sense impossible. Its skin wasn't actually skin, but something that resembled scar tissue covering its entire body, as if it had been flayed and healed over and over, and its spine pressed through that tissue in distinct vertebral bumps. Too many vertebrae, a column that should have belonged to something serpentine rather than quasi-hominid. Reeves fired point blank, his Beretta's muzzle nearly touching the entity's torso, and the bullet hit but simply passed through without producing blood or causing reaction beyond making the creature's head swivel toward him with that mechanical precision. Void eyes studying him with what might have been recognition, might have been mockery. It opened its mouth, revealing those 3 rows of canine teeth, and spoke with Reeves's voice, his exact voice down to the Virginia accent and military cadence. "Whatever you do not acknowledge if it attempts to speak." Vincent Reeves, Staff Sergeant, serial number 498773662. Next of kin, Eleanor Reeves of Richmond, phone number 8045550143. The entity had somehow accessed information that should have been classified, was reciting Reeves's personnel file from memory, and the implications of that, the suggestion that these things had infiltrated military databases or possessed intelligence networks that exceeded human capability, shattered what remained of his professional composure. Webb fired his sidearm in rapid succession, round after round into the entity at center mass, face, limbs, but it simply stood there, absorbing impacts until his slide locked back on an empty chamber, and then it moved. The attack happened faster than human perception could process. One moment the entity was 10 feet away, the next it had crossed that distance, and its elongated hand was wrapped around Webb's throat, fingers so long they overlapped, meeting behind his neck, and it lifted him off the ground one-handed while he thrashed and clawed at the grip that was cutting off his air supply. The other 6 entities dropped through the roof hole, simultaneously landing in perfect circle around the remaining. Soldiers cutting off every escape route, moving with coordinated intelligence that proved beyond any doubt they were operating as a unit, as a team with assigned roles and tactical awareness. Fisher emptied her magazine into the entity, holding Webb, hitting it multiple times in the head, and finally it reacted not by releasing him, but by turning its attention toward her, and what happened next would haunt the survivors. Nightmares for whatever remained of their lives. The entity's free hand moved with blurring speed, reaching out toward Fisher, and though it never made physical contact, simply passed its palm in front of her face from a distance of 3 feet. She collapsed immediately unconscious before hitting the ground, as if proximity to that hand had somehow shut down her nervous system remotely. Biological warfare on a level that made conventional weapons seem laughably primitive. At 0559 hours, exactly 21 minutes before the scheduled airstrike that would erase all evidence of what occurred here, the entities suddenly stopped, froze completely as if receiving simultaneous telepathic instruction, and as one they turned their void-socket eyes toward the eastern wall, toward where the sun was beginning to lighten the horizon beyond the mountains. The entity holding Webb opened its hand, dropping him carelessly, and all 7 of them scrambled toward the roof hole with desperate urgency that suggested genuine fear, climbing over each other in their haste to escape the building, their movements now graceless and panicked, rather than fluid and predatory. Washington had grabbed Fisher's unconscious body, shaking her while screaming her name, and when her eyes finally flickered open, she whispered through lips gone blue from shock, "They're not leaving, they're regrouping. Sunrise doesn't kill them. It just makes them retreat. And they'll be back tonight. They always come back." The compound had become deathly silent. The scratching and clicking ceased completely, and through the hole in the roof, they could see gray dawn light spreading across the sky. And in that light, just before the entities disappeared completely into the forest, Reeves saw one of them pause at the tree line and turn back its void eyes focused directly on him. And he knew with absolute certainty that it was, memorizing him, learning his face, his scent, his fear signature, marking him for a future encounter that would inevitably occur regardless of whatever escape they managed. The rescue helicopter arrived at 0617 hours. A Sikorsky UH-60 Black Hawk that appeared through the mountain fog like salvation incarnate. But the soldiers who fast roped down onto the compound grounds weren't standard rescue personnel. They wore no unit patches, no rank insignia, just black tactical gear and gas masks that obscured their faces completely. And they moved with practiced efficiency that spoke of extensive experience with exactly this type of situation, pulling the surviving station cold water crew from the facility without conversation, without questions, simply grabbing them and hauling them toward the helicopter, while a second team spread throughout the compound, placing what Reeves recognized as incendiary charges as strategic structural points. Webb was still alive but catatonic, his throat bruised purple-black from where the entity had gripped him, and he didn't resist when the masked soldiers strapped him to a stretcher and loaded him aboard, his eyes staring at nothing, while his lips moved in constant repetition of words too quiet to understand. Fisher had regained consciousness, but seemed incapable of coordinating her limbs properly, her left side partially paralyzed as if she'd suffered a stroke. And 2 soldiers had to carry her between them while she kept trying to tell them something urgent about the DNA they left behind. You need to test it. You need to understand what they are. But her words slurred together until they became unintelligible. Signal had managed to retrieve a hard drive from the communications equipment before evacuation, classified data that documented the night's events in electronic format. But before the helicopter even lifted off, one of the masked soldiers simply took it from him. No explanation, no receipt, just confiscation with the casual authority of someone who knew there would be no consequences for that action. The airstrike came at 0634 hours, exactly as scheduled, not conventional munitions, but thermite weapons that burned at temperatures exceeding 2,500 degrees Celsius, hot enough to vaporize organic tissue and melt steel, ensuring that no physical evidence would survive analysis. Through the helicopter's side window, as they gained altitude, Reeves watched Station Coldwater disappear beneath a white phosphorus inferno that would burn for 3 days straight, consuming the prefabricated structures, the experimental equipment, the scratched walls and torn roof, and most importantly, any biological material the entities might have left behind that could have proven their existence to scientific communities that preferred comfortable ignorance over disturbing revelation. The facility burned so completely that geological surveys conducted the following month would show the ground itself had been transformed into a glass-like substance, the Earth's memory of what occurred there erased as thoroughly as human records. They flew not to the nearest military hospital or even nearby Fort Lewis, but to a classified medical facility near Tacoma that didn't appear on aviation charts, a windowless concrete structure surrounded by triple-layer security fencing that suggested the patients treated here suffered from conditions that required extraordinary containment measures. The doctors who examined them wore neither name tags nor indicated their credentials, asking questions in clinical monotone while recording responses on tablets that were collected immediately after each interview and presumably stored somewhere that congressional oversight would never reach. Reeves tried to explain what had happened, providing detailed descriptions of the entities, appearance, their coordinated tactics, their apparent intelligence, and psychological warfare capabilities, but the doctor interviewing him showed no surprise, no skepticism, simply nodded and typed with the bored efficiency of someone processing routine incident reports rather than testimony about creatures that shouldn't exist. When Reeves demanded to know what the entities were, what biological category they fell into, the doctor finally met his eyes and said with complete emotional detachment, "You encountered specimens consistent with unclassified hominid entity designation, pale crawler, colloquial designation Rake, known to military intelligence since at least 1947 and possibly much earlier, demonstrating all characteristic behaviors, including territory establishment, human tracking, voice replication, and psychological predation. Your facility was positioned in a known Rake territory as part of ongoing observation protocols to better understand entity behavior, patterns, and develop effective countermeasures for future encounters. The casual admission that they'd been used as bait, that command had knowingly placed them in mortal danger too. Gather research data should have enraged Reeves, but he found he had no anger, left only a hollow exhaustion and the terrible understanding that whatever he'd believed about transparency and military honor had been naive delusion. Fisher's partial paralysis proved permanent, neurological damage the doctors attributed to extreme proximity exposure to entity bioelectric field, suggesting the things possessed some form of electrical defense mechanism that could disrupt human nervous systems without physical contact. Webb never spoke again, diagnosed with selective mutism and severe PTSD, spending the remainder of his military career in psychiatric facilities before being medically discharged with a pension and a file that listed his condition as resulting from training accident. Washington, Signal, and Moss were kept in the medical facility for 3 weeks, subjected to daily psychological evaluations, and what they were told was preventive medical treatment, but which involved injections of unknown substances that made their memories of the incident progressively hazier, chemical fog settling over events that had been crystal clear initially. By the time they were released, all three reported difficulty recalling specific details, their testimonies becoming vague and contradictory, and they signed non-disclosure agreements that made them legally and financially liable for any public discussion of Station Coldwater or what had occurred there, with the explicit threat that violation would result in imprisonment under espionage statutes and permanent separation from family members deemed security risks through their exposure to classified information. The official story released to the facility's limited paper trail described Station Coldwater as lost due to structural fire resulting from faulty generator, with all personnel successfully evacuated and subsequently reassigned to non-combat positions following smoke inhalation treatment. But Reeves knew, and the others knew, despite the chemical hazing of their memories, that somewhere in classified files, accessible only to individuals whose existence itself was classified accurate records, existed detailing everything that had happened, every scratch in voice replication and coordinated attack data being analyzed by people whose job was to understand predators that evolution had never been supposed to produce. In the final moments before he was escorted from the medical facility to begin his new assignment at a desk job in Virginia, far from any wilderness that might harbor things with void socket eyes, Reeves saw through a window something that froze his blood. One of the masked soldiers from the rescue operation removing their gas mask, and the face beneath was wrong, slightly wrong, proportions skewed in ways he couldn't articulate, and the eyes were just a bit too dark, too void-like, and he realized with sick certainty that the military didn't just study these entities. They had learned to identify them even when they tried to blend in, and perhaps most disturbingly, Some of those studied specimens had learned to blend in far better than anyone wanted to admit, walking among uniformed personnel with stolen faces and borrowed identities, waiting for opportunities to return to forests where they'd been hunting, successfully for millennia, before humans had decided to build vulnerable structures in territories that had never belonged to anyone except the pale crawlers that watched and waited and learned. The official military records for Station Coldwater were sealed under classification protocols that wouldn't expire until 2073, 75 years after the incident. And even then, the files would undergo national security review before any potential declassification, a process designed to ensure that anyone directly involved would be long dead before information reached public awareness. Staff Sergeant Vincent Reeves received honorable discharge in 2003 with full benefits and a commendation for distinguished service in classified operations, spending his remaining years in Richmond, where he worked as a security consultant for private companies, and never, not once in the 17 years until his death from apparent heart failure in 2020, discussed his military service beyond vague references to communications work in the Northwest. Corporal Amanda Fisher's partial paralysis limited her career options, leading to medical retirement in 2001, but her disability paperwork made no mention of the actual cause, listing instead service-connected neurological damage from industrial accident. And she died in 2009 from what was officially ruled a self-inflicted overdose of prescribed medications. Though her sister insisted, Amanda had been terrified of taking anything that might make her sleep too deeply, afraid of what might approach while she remained unconscious. Sergeant Marcus Webb spent the last 12 years of his life in veteran psychiatric facilities, never regaining speech, and his death in 2010 from complications during treatment occurred 3 days after a night supervisor reported finding him in a state of extreme agitation, scratching at the walls of his room hard enough to break fingernails and draw blood, though what had triggered this episode remained undocumented in official records. Corporal Tyrell Washington received transfer to supply logistics at Fort Bragg, a desk position that kept him far from fieldwork, and he served until retirement in 2015, before dying 2 years later from a pulmonary embolism that his autopsy suggested had been caused by blood clots that formed with unusual rapidity, though the pathologist noted several anomalous findings that were removed from the final report at the request of unnamed federal officials who arrived during the examination and confiscated tissue samples without providing explanation or legal justification. Specialist David Signal Park transitioned to civilian life in 2002, taking employment with defense contractors as a communications analyst, but his security clearances were mysteriously revoked in 2006 for undisclosed reasons despite no evidence of misconduct, effectively ending his career in the field he'd trained for his entire adult life, and in 2013 he disappeared while hiking in Olympic National Park. His body never recovered, despite extensive search operations that local rangers privately admitted seemed strangely perfunctory. As if searchers already knew they wouldn't find anything but were maintaining appearances for the benefit of concerned family members, who kept asking why the search grid carefully avoided certain sections of forest that Park's hiking plan explicitly indicated he intended to explore. Specialist Jennifer Moss served the minimum required time before accepting early separation in 2001, returning to her home state of California, where she married her high school sweetheart and had 2 children, attempting to build a normal life far from mountains and forests. But in 2018, she was found dead in her locked home, with no signs of forced entry or struggle, her body positioned in the center of her bedroom, with arms and legs extended at angles that the responding officers described in their initial reports as ritualistic, though this phrasing was removed in subsequent versions, and the official cause of death remained undetermined, despite autopsy findings showing she died from what appeared to be sudden total neurological shutdown without any identifiable medical cause. Her face locked in an expression that the coroner, in notes that were never included in the final report, described as recognition. the hard drive that Signal had attempted to retrieve from Station Coldwater's communication. Equipment containing potentially the only digital evidence of the night's events was logged into a classified archive facility in West Virginia known officially as the Anomalous Materials Repository, a storage complex that houses approximately 47,000 items related to incidents that government agencies prefer to study in perpetuity rather than acknowledge publicly. The thermite destruction of Station Coldwater was so complete that subsequent geological surveys showed unusual mineral formations in the area, consistent with extreme heat exposure, but these findings were buried in technical documentation that never reached academic journals, and the coordinates of the former facility were removed from military databases, the land returning to state forest designation, where it remains closed to public access due to ongoing environmental hazard assessment that has now continued for 27 years without resolution or timeline for completion. Families of the 6 soldiers involved in the incident received standard military notification letters explaining their loved ones' service and subsequent medical discharges or retirements, none of the correspondence mentioning Station Coldwater by name or providing details beyond boilerplate language about classified operations in support of national security objectives, and attempts by family members to access medical records or incident reports were systematically denied through bureaucratic processes designed to exhaust persistence rather than provide transparency. The entities themselves, the pale crawlers that military intelligence had been tracking since at least the late 1940s, remained active throughout the Pacific Northwest, and according to classified reports that occasionally surface through whistleblower channels, have been encountered in similar circumstances dozens of times in the subsequent decades, always following the same escalation pattern, always demonstrating the same intelligence and coordination, always leaving just enough survivors to ensure that institutional knowledge persists within classified military circles while public awareness remains, carefully managed through strategic disinformation and aggressive non-disclosure enforcement. Theories about their origin range from undiscovered hominid subspecies that evolved in isolation to something far stranger, with some internal documents suggesting they represent the parallel evolutionary line that developed intelligence specifically optimized for predation on human beings, creatures that learned to hunt humans so effectively that they became dependent on that specific prey, territories where they're active, showing statistically anomalous human disappearance rates that persist across centuries. The most disturbing aspect documented in classified research is their apparent ability to adapt and learn from each encounter, improving tactics, developing countermeasures to human technology, and demonstrating what researchers term iterative behavioral evolution that occurs far too rapidly to be explained by conventional natural selection, suggesting either impossibly fast generational turnover or something that resembles cultural transmission, the terrifying implication that these things teach each other, pass knowledge between individuals or possibly between generations, creating a predator species that becomes more dangerous over time rather than being controlled through human advancement. The creation of facilities like Station Coldwater, positioning small military crews in known pale crawler territories, continues to this day, according to anonymously leaked Pentagon budget documents showing line items for remote observation posts in regions that correlate exactly with historical encounter data, suggesting the military-industrial complex has accepted these entities as permanent features of the landscape rather than threats to be eliminated, treating them instead as subjects to be studied, understood, and perhaps eventually controlled or weaponized. The soldiers who served at Station Coldwater and survived, whether they succumbed to apparent accidents, medical anomalies, or simply vanished into statistics that nobody officially connects, represent just 6 names in a casualty list that stretches back decades and forward into an unknown future where the boundary between human civilization and older things that never left continues to be patrolled by individuals who never receive recognition or acknowledgement for the psychological and physical prices they pay in service of maintaining comfortable ignorance for populations that sleep better not, knowing what watches from tree lines at the edge of developed land. The pale crawlers remain patient and persistent, existing in territories that predate human mapping, and according to the final entry in the last report submitted from Station Coldwater at 0547 hours on October 12, 1998, just before all communications ceased permanently, Staff Sergeant Reeves typed 7 words that summarize everything future crews facing similar situations need to understand. They're not attacking us. They're studying us. Don't forget to follow our channel for more military encounters. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into phenomena that defy everything we've been taught about reality. And subscribe to join our community of truth seekers who refuse to accept official explanations that ignore overwhelming evidence.